All right, welcome everybody. We are at the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started because I know we have a lot that we want to cover in just a little bit of time. My name is Richard Coble. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I'm I am the associate pastor right now here at Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church. And we are just so thankful for all of you all who have come to join us for this important conversation. Please feel free, those of y'all who are in the pews, if you want to come and join the circle, but also if you're more comfortable in the pews, that's absolutely fine as well. But we do hope that this will be a good kind of conversational hour together where we have time for folks to talk and to ask questions and make points and all of that. I am so thankful to Grace Covenant community member Tricia Hines and also Eileen McMinn. And they are both a part of Just Peace for Israel-Palestine, and they are really the ones who organized this hour and got our speakers here and everything. So I'm going to give them the mic in just a second to introduce our speakers. But just want to say again, hello to everybody. Also want to say hello to everybody who is joining us on the live stream. And let's go to God in prayer. Let's all take a good and collective breath in and out. Liberating and loving Spirit, we are thankful for this time. We are thankful for all those who have gathered for this important and urgent conversation. We pray that you would open us up in this hour so that we may hear one another. We pray all these things with thankful hearts. Amen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tricia Hines.
Thank you. In 2022, the Presbyterian General Assembly passed a resolution saying that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is apartheid. In doing so, the Presbyterian Church stood with human rights groups like B'Tselem and Amnesty International. As you can imagine, there was pushback from all sides. Heath Rader will start off our program today with some background on the Presbyterian Church's commitment to supporting Palestinian rights. A native of Richmond, Virginia, and a retired CEO of the Greater Richmond chapter of the American Red Cross, where he coordinated the organization's work in Virginia and the District of Columbia. Prior to that, he served 12 years as president of the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, now part of the Union Presbyterian Seminary, where he was the first layperson to head one of the Presbyterian Church's USA's theological schools. He's a graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University and earned a Master of Arts from Union Presbyterian Seminary and a doctorate in education from North Carolina State University. A member of the Presbyterian Agency Mission Board, he also served on the board of the Montreat Conference Center. He and his wife Peggy have now live in Montreat, but have both spent many years being involved in learning and helping all of us understand about Palestine. The Presbyterian Outlet once praised Heath as a smooth Southern Presbyterian. So Heath, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tricia. I'm pleased to be here to talk about a subject that I have a great passion about, as does my wife Peggy, who actually introduced me to this topic because she went to Israel and Palestine in 1983 while I was going to South Africa, and we came home absolutely passionate about what we had seen, and since then have been able to take each other back and to share and learn. But in order to be true to the time commitment that I accepted for this, those of you who know me know that that's not easy for me. I'm going to be referring a lot to remarks. You know, I've tried to write it out so I can say things expeditiously. But I'm willing to elaborate or certainly answer questions at the last part of our session as it is planned. The positive relationship which the Presbyterian Church USA, which is the largest of the Presbyterian denominations in this country. There are several, but the Presbyterian Church USA is the sort of big granddaddy of most of them. The relationship between us and the Jewish community has been a strong and lengthy one. Although Christians and Jews don't see Jesus necessarily the same way, both of our faith communities have long been united in areas of human right and justice. Thus it is that when Presbyterians stand up for Palestinian rights, it is often seen by others as anti-Semitic on our part toward our Jewish brethren. And while Presbyterians are adamant in speaking out against anti-Semitism, we also have long believed that the discrimination and treatment of Palestinians, particularly those living in Israel or Palestine, is at best unjust, at worst sinful. In no way can I tell you a lengthy background of this strong yet somewhat fragile relationship in a matter of minutes. But two acts in recent years have brought this to the forefront, and based on Tricia's request, I wish to focus on them. In 2014, the year I was elected moderator of the PCUSA General Assembly, many in our denomination believed that the hot topic, and there are always a lot of hot topics, that would be discussed and debated was to be the one which would either allow or not allow ministers to perform marriages for same-sex couples. Ironically, the commissioners and our church had pretty much worked through their feelings about that, and that measure passed with very little controversy and dissension. But another overture was brought forth that caused the church to almost split. That one, 2 years earlier in 2012, had been defeated narrowly by a motion, and this is to divest our church monies from certain companies doing business with Israel. The motion had been defeated 333 to 331. So that lets you know how split the church was. And then it was brought up again. So in 2014, it was brought to the floor, and this time it passed by a vote of 310 to 303. 7 votes out of more than 600. The companies, Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, and Motorola, were accused of being engaged in, quote, non-peaceful pursuits, end quote, in Israel, which translated means that equipment that they were making and selling to the Israeli government was being modified and used as warfare against Palestinians. This decision was broadcast on national and international news outlets. I was telling Tricia a few minutes ago that we had family members who were working in Jerusalem, and my picture was on the front page of the paper, having been elected and having led the church to make this awful decision that was so anti-Jews. I was also interviewed the next morning on CNN World News, and I heard from people from all over the world. It was fascinating how one brief stint can give you your moment of fame. But many of our Jewish friends were livid. I received hate mail, death threats, and spent 75% of my time that first year, and I was home maybe 5 nights a month during those 2 years, but spent 75% of my time meeting with Jewish and Presbyterian leaders across the USA and around the world. I also was in Palestine and Israel and met with Palestinian leaders, as well as people here who were strong advocates of Palestinians. And even though a statement was placed in the national news release on the day the overture was adopted, which quoted me as saying immediately after the vote, "In no way is this a reflection for our lack of love for our sisters and for our Jewish sisters and brothers." And I believed that sincerely and believe it today. It was an act of concern and anger against the Israeli government. But most of our Jewish brothers and sisters did not accept me at my word at that time. In one of my earliest meetings, I was asked to go to New York City and meet with 4 rabbis from 4 of the largest synagogues in New York City and their Presbyterian minister counterparts, ministers of 4 of the largest Presbyterian churches in New York City. And these four partners worked closely with each other, the rabbis and ministers. My invitation said, in our four churches, there's a very large number of members, possibly as many as 50%, who are married to Jews. The decision here by our denomination is not only dividing our churches and synagogues, but also having a very negative impact on some of the marriages of our congregants. So I went as they requested, keeping it as a secret from the media, and also making sure that no attention was called to my visit. We met at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and after we'd been introduced and it had been explained to these people that the moderator is only a spokesperson for the denomination and cannot make decisions nor change votes, I was asked if I would like to give some opening comments. I wanted to dialogue, and these rabbis, I could even feel the anger. And so my question was, I just need to know, as a person who doesn't fully understand, why the anger is so harsh toward our church. We were divided. We were deeply divided in the vote, and I never once heard anybody speaking against Jews. I only heard people talking against the government. So after a brief moment of silence, one of the rabbis responded, a young man, but quite forcefully, saying, "It's because you have betrayed us. For years we've worked together on human rights in regard to women's rights, religious freedom, racial concerns, so many other concerns, and we've always been partners. We've always been able to count on you. But now we have been shamed by you in a very public way, and you have let us down." Well, lots more happened at that meeting and so many other things over those years, but we did leave that day on cordial terms, and I must say that in the ensuing months, all four of those rabbis became good friends of mine. Not because we all agreed, but because we learned about each other. But I never lost my personal concern and support for the plight of the Palestinians, nor my anger and grave concern about what was happening. And in my trips to Palestine and Israel, I was always so aware of how many people didn't understand the other side of that wall. They just didn't know it, especially the Jews. Or the Palestinians knew what one side of the wall was like. But the others, so many didn't, or didn't even believe. Fast forward to last year, 2022. Once again, our denomination received national attention, which drew the ire of many American Jews. As Tricia mentioned, in January a year ago, our stated clerk, who is the paid head staff person for our denomination, made a speech which went viral entitled, "In a World of Trouble and Despair, We Need a Unity of Spirit." And in this speech, he said, "The continued occupation in Palestine and Israel is 21st century slavery and should be abolished immediately. Given the history of Jewish humble beginnings and persecution, there should be no ambiguity as to the ethics, moral, and dehumanizing marginalization and enslavement of other human beings." And it was in that speech that he referred to this act as apartheid. Now, if you heard me a while ago, I told you I was in South Africa when Peggy was in Palestine in 1983, the height of apartheid. I knew what apartheid was, and I agree with our stated clerk. But his comments caused an uproar both in our denomination and among Jewish communities all over the country. In part, it contributed to an overture which was presented to the General Assembly last summer in 2022 to recognize that Israel's laws, policies, and practices regarding the Palestinian people fulfill the international legal definition of apartheid. And in this instance, apartheid is legally defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Many Presbyterians, as well as many Jews, and also a number of our black friends, had concerns about the language that was used in this speech and the fact that they felt it was not accurate, nor that it represented things in a way that could be helpful to our relationships with each other. It was and still is an argued issue, and our church bodies still are grappling with its implications. Tricia brought a copy, I think, of that overture. I think you've all gotten a copy in the handout. And it was passed by the General Assembly by a vote of 266 to 116. Not a real divided assembly on this one. Yeah, there are so many complex issues related to all of this, and I wish it were as simple as ABC. And I have a lot of stories and situations I could share. As Presbyterians, we believe in a democratic form of government. In fact, our national government was formed by the Presbyterians' form of government. And so for us, we do take seriously what our majority says. And so we try after an election to move forward in a unified way and seek to do what we can to represent our whole rather than just one part. But it doesn't prevent us from having separate ideas and thoughts. And so I will be glad to answer more questions, but my time, I think, has run out. That, I hope, gives you just a brief overview of the complexity of the issue with Presbyterians, Palestinians, and Jews. There is no doubt that our denomination is adamantly opposed to the inhumane treatment of the Palestinians and believe that we must stand up for their rights. There is also no doubt that we have a love relationship for social justice with our Jewish friends, and that we are not speaking in an anti-Semitic way when we are being critical of Palestine, of what the Israel government is doing with Palestine. And so that continues to be where the conflict raises. And now let's hear more from our good Jewish friends.
Thanks, Heath. Yeah, thank you all for coming out today, and thanks to,
I'm supposed to introduce you.
oh yeah, fair enough.
Okay. We're happy to have Zach with us today. This is Zach Whitus. He is a representative of the New Israel Fund, which is an organization dedicated to improving Israeli society. Zach also has the advantage of having recently spent time in the occupied territories, notably Hebron, and has graciously agreed to share some of his experiences with us. And he is, as Mr. Rada just mentioned, a young Jewish man, so he can also speak to those issues. So, thank you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you so much. And good to be with you all this beautiful afternoon. Yeah, so as Eileen mentioned, I'm the Young Leadership and Education Coordinator at the New Israel Fund. And the New Israel Fund is an organization that's existed for about 50 years and is dedicated to building civil society in Israel to work on a number of social issues in Israel, including the rights of Jews of color, economic rights, feminist struggles, in addition to the issue of Palestinian human rights. I joined the New Israel Fund in May of last year, so I'm relatively new, and that was coming just after this 3-month period of solidarity activism in the occupied West Bank, in which I was based in the South Hebron Hills, so the very southern reaches of the West Bank. And so I thought it would be helpful, before I talk about my experiences on the ground there, encountering Israeli soldiers and standing in solidarity with Palestinian residents, talk a bit more about the apartheid definition. And I think as a staff member at the New Israel Fund, I'm well placed to do that because several of our grantee organizations, like B'Tselem, that was already mentioned, the leading human rights center in Israel, as well as Yeshidin, a group of volunteer lawyers, have really been at the forefront of the conversation within Israeli society around the accusation of apartheid. It's an accusation that Palestinians have been making for many decades, but that many Israelis are also seeing the truth of now, including these leading civil society organizations that NIF is proud to back. And so I wanted to just briefly read a bit from the Yesh Din legal opinion that came out actually before the B'Tselem opinion about apartheid. So as Heath mentioned, apartheid isn't just a comparison to the situation in South Africa in the 20th century, but actually is the application of international law. And that international law is based principally in two documents, the Apartheid Convention, as well as the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. And so now looking at the Yesh Din legal opinion, and I think this will be helpful as I talked through my experience for people to sort of see how it applies in the things that I saw. So according to Yesh Din, they believe that the Israeli regime in the West Bank meets the definition of persecution and denial of rights under the conventions according to a few discrete categories, namely the denial of civil rights, a dual legal system, the denial of development, such as like infrastructure and things of that nature, a policy of separation between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, land expropriation and dispossession, persecution of regime opponents and critics, and the forcible transfer of a population. So keep those different categories in mind as I talk now about the things that I saw from February to May of last year. So I was based, as I said, in the South Hebron Hills, which is a relatively remote region of Palestine that is almost entirely, the area that I was in was Area C of the West Bank, which is an area that is under full Israeli control, in contrast to the Palestinian cities, which enjoy greater control by the Palestinian Authority, the sort of government in creation that exists there. And so when you're in Area C, that's the area where all of the settlements exist, all of the Israeli settlements are based. And it's also where all Palestinian agriculture, or the vast majority of Palestinian agriculture is. So myself and a number of other Jews with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence moved into these remote villages, traditional Palestinian villages in this area, to do daily solidarity tasks. So what does that mean? It means accompanying shepherds who are at risk of having their lands taken away from them by settlers, as well as the army. It means documenting human rights abuses when we encounter them. It means serving as protective presence, both with the shepherds and also in the villages, because as internationals, we have certain legal sort of a legal shield around us that can sometimes offer protection to the Palestinians around us, and also communicating everything we saw with the outside world, so through social media, through emails back home, op-eds, letters, and now meetings like this one. And so basically every day I would go out with a Palestinian shepherd who would venture out from his village and would inevitably come into an area that was being contested by settlers who have their own flocks that they're trying to graze in the area. And these settlers would often approach the Palestinians and say, "You're on my land, like get off." And they'll either try to use force against the Palestinians, or they would call the army in, and the army would act as sort of the enforcer of the settlers' demands. And the army would come, and me and my fellow activists would try to de-escalate the situation and also mediate between the Palestinians and the army to try to prevent any violence from occurring, and if we could, create a space for the Palestinians to continue shepherding through that day so that they could earn their livelihood and live on for the further period. And so that was like a daily routine for us. Like wake up, pretty early in the morning, go out with the shepherds. Some days nothing would happen, but very often there would be these encroachments by the settlers and by military. Other things that occurred were we would be just sitting in the villages having some downtime, and military or Israeli police would come into the village and start checking people's car registration and confiscating cars that they said were not properly registered. We could go into it. It's a whole complicated thing about how cars are registered in the West Bank, but suffice it to say that the checking of Palestinian registration and the confiscation of their cars is another tool that successive Israeli governments have used to harass Palestinians and to make life in Area C near impossible. So they would come into the villages not irregularly, start confiscating cars, and there would be Palestinians who would gather and start chanting and sort of impromptu demonstrating, and the situations could get quite tense. And our role there was to document, to try to de-escalate as best we could, and letting the soldiers and the army know that and the police know that the world is watching and that there's an eye on what's happening here. Many of the villages that we were in had no access to electricity or water networks. So whereas the settlements, which would be within a few hundred meters of these Palestinian hamlets, were connected to the national electrical grid and the water networks, most of the Palestinian villages in the area were not hooked up. There's one situation in the village of El Khair, where I spent one of the 3 of my months there, in which they actually have power lines going from the settlement over the Palestinian village to some chicken coops on the other side that the settlers run and operate as an organic chicken farm. And so the chickens had electricity 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, the Palestinians were relying upon solar panels donated by international aid organizations. And so there's a whole bunch of stories I could tell you, but another one that I want to share at this point is from a moment when there had been a spate of armed attacks within Israel against Jewish Israelis. This was in last spring. So within the 1948 boundaries of Israel, there were these armed attacks in Beersheba, in Tel Aviv, and other places. And in response to that, settlers in the West Bank, including in the south of Brun Hills, where I was based, took revenge on the Palestinian communities around them, even though there was no pretense of any connection between the Palestinian village that happened to be located near the settlement and the people who committed committed the murder or these other attempted murder against Jewish Israelis. And in one instance, there was a fight that broke out between some Palestinian shepherds near the village of Tuwani, another one of the villages we were based, and the settlers. And there was a fight, who started it, who provoked who, I couldn't really tell you, to be honest with you, in that moment. But I do know that when the army intervened, they intervened on the side of the Jewish settlers and arrested the man named Hussein. He's a friend of mine. Blindfolded him and took him away to an Israeli military prison in Beitar, I believe, in the settlement of Beitar. He was held there for a number of days, had to pay a few $1,000s in fees in order to be released. Meanwhile, the Jewish Israeli was not even brought in for questioning, and that's the norm in this area, that the Palestinians will be arrested, few questions asked. Meanwhile, the Jewish Israelis are given, beyond the benefit of the doubt. But if a Jewish Israeli, and it does happen occasionally that a Jewish Israeli, might be arrested for a certain crime, if it's egregious enough and it's blatant enough, they would be tried in a civilian court. Israeli civilian law extends to the settlers in the settlements on the West Bank. But for the Palestinians, like my friend Hussein, he's brought to a military jail, and he'll be seen, if his case goes to trial, he'll be tried in front of a military judge. And the conviction rate, as you can imagine, in a military court like this, is basically 99%. Not much semblance of a fair, impartial hearing in those cases. And oftentimes the proceedings are conducted in Hebrew. They try to get Arabic translators, but very often do not. And so the proceedings often take place in a language that the accused cannot even understand. And I think thinking about the accusations of anti-Semitism that have been, I would say, weaponized against the Presbyterian Church, and thinking about my own upbringing in the Metro Detroit area in a Jewish community there, and staying very involved in Jewish community through my time in Chicago, in Asheville, and soon to be in New York, where I'm headed next. I have a visceral appreciation, a visceral feeling for the generational trauma that I believe leads so many of my people, including family members, friends, to really shut out the truth when it comes to the situation in the occupied territories, and to have what I would say is a real trauma response with the anger and the sort of counter accusations when people do criticize Israel, pointing out like some of the things that I mentioned today about how shepherds are treated, about the dual legal system, any of these things. And I think it comes from a place of wanting to defend our community that has had genocide perpetrated against it, and it comes from a deep desire for safety and security in this world, and it comes from a really deep-seated belief that the state of Israel is the kind of antidote to that historical trauma and is the place that will keep us safe and secure. And so when people criticize it and say that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid or other war crimes, which groups like B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have often accused Israel of, United Nations as well, yeah. They feel like it's undermining their personal safety and the safety of their family and their communities. And so it makes it really tough to have an honest and frank conversation. But I'm a firm believer that the only way for Jewish people to really be safe and to achieve liberation is for the Palestinians to be safe and to achieve their liberation. And so it requires a frank discussion of the issues, and it requires confronting the realities on the ground. And I think that when we're in conversation with each other today, with people of different faith backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, we can have honest intellectual debate about, is the term apartheid applicable? Is this other war crime, is that applicable in this case? But whatever else is true, we have to stay rooted in the realities on the ground and to people's lived experiences. And so whether or not people walk away today with clarity that yes, Israel's committing the crime of apartheid, or no, they're not, I would just ask that people stay rooted in those basic truths, and to try to, as skills I believe everyone here has, to seek first to understand, and on the I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, we'd like to open it up for questions and comments. And shall I walk around with the microphone? Yeah, let me just walk around with this. You can give your name or not.
I'm glad to. I'm Tom Byers. I would find it very helpful if we could have a definition of the internationally recognized crime of apartheid. It seems to me that that's the import of this particular resolution, to place that label on these actions. Now, it's been well known for a long time that Presbyterians have a concern about justice for Palestinians. And Heath, I see you nodding your head, and I assume that our leaders, friends among the Jewish community have known and respected that. So I'm wondering what is added by this particular action, because certainly that word is very freighted, and I wonder if somebody could address that and tell us more about the origin of this international legal definition.
Zach, you look like you might have pulled it up.
Well, Heath actually provided, I think, the sort of kernel of that definition in his remarks. But as I said, the basis of it is in international law, especially the Apartheid Convention, which I believe was ratified in the 1970s. So going from the situation in South Africa to create a generally applicable definition, and then also in the charter of the Rome Statute, which was ratified by the vast majority of countries in the world, excepting the United States, which has had many conflicts with the ICC, also in the case of U.S. War crimes in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, the Rome Statute being consensual international law. And so, Heath, if you want to turn to the quote maybe that you provided, that's sort of the kernel. And then there are a number of actions that those conventions and charters lay out as the constituent elements of the crime. So if you want to read the quote maybe, and then I can read some of these policies. Yeah.
All right. Apartheid is legally defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one group of persons over any other group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And I'm going to give it right back to you. But, Tom, I think also you were asking why maybe did J. Herbert Nelson, our stated clerk, choose at this time to use such an inflammatory word in 2022, last January. I don't know the full answer to that. I had a number of private conversations with him afterwards because he knew that in my term I had worked with a number of Jewish leaders, and he was wanting to check out some of those relationships and see. I surmise that Presbyterians, like so many of us about many things happening in our political world, at times just get to the point we say, let's just call it what it is and not worry so much about whether or not it's going to be inflammatory. We've got to get people upset. We've got to get people moving. I think that was sort of a spirit of what I felt was happening when this was done, that it was not necessarily any systematic way of looking at this as the time and the moment in terms of history, but saying in terms of our passion and the fact that we're just allowing this to continue, this is the time and the moment. That's my hunch, if that answers your question.
And I can speak a bit to why other organizations like Yesh Din and B'Tselem believe now is the time to issue these opinions on apartheid. Traditionally or historically, you've heard about the military occupation. And military occupation actually isn't illegal under international law. It's regulated by international law. That said, international law views occupations as temporary. There's a war that begins for one reason or another, and it's possible for one state to occupy the lands, the territory of another state, and then that occupation will require issuing laws to regulate the territory and also protect the rights of the population under occupation. But that's supposed to be a temporary situation. And Israel, for the successive Israeli governments, I should say, have used the temporary nature of occupation as a defense of its policies, saying that, yes, like this is a less than ideal situation, but it's a temporary one, and the final status of it will be worked out in negotiations with a Palestinian partner, whether it's the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, you name it. But I think that the last round of negotiations that were serious at all was under the Obama administration, and there were grave doubts even at that time that they were going to lead to any kind of final status arrangement. And so we're in a situation now where there are no high-level negotiations happening, but this regime of deep inequality continues, and it appears to fewer and fewer people to be a temporary one. And so I believe that's why, and if you read the B'Tselem report, the Eshtin report, and the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they allude to these realities and to the seemingly permanent nature of it. And seeing it as a permanent situation necessitates a different kind of legal analysis. And so you have an organization like Yesh Din, which says that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid in the West Bank, but not in Israel proper or Israel within its pre-1967 borders. Meanwhile, you have B'Tselem, which says, no, it's one regime of Jewish supremacy between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And you have Amnesty International echoing that stance as well. So even within Israeli human rights organizations and then international ones, you do see, like, maybe to some people they seem like slight disagreements, but disagreements in exactly how you're applying the term. But I believe that the context of it being 55 years plus of this military regime in the West Bank is what brought the sense of urgency in bringing the apartheid accusation forward. Yeah.
I'll reach the other side, but I'm going to finish. I'm Pam. You might have answered my question, but this map is really interesting. So I know there was a war in '67, and these green areas are Palestinian lands that there's a military occupation by Israel, and that's legal. That's the green.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Israel's occupying it, and that's legal, you're saying.
So in green you have what's denoted as Palestinian land,
Right.
and then in white is Jewish settlement. So before 1948, there was no state of Israel. The state of Israel was established in 1948 in the first Arab-Israeli War, which lasted from 1947 until 1949. And so, so on the left you have the lands that were in which there were Jewish settlements before the establishment of the state, and you can see on this map that it's a minority of the land in what was mandatory Palestine.
Right.
And then you go forward to the UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, which preceded the first Arab-Israeli War, in which they proposed. So this map is not a map showing what really existed, but what was proposed by the United Nations and ratified by a majority of the General Assembly. And so in green you have the land that was supposed to be allocated to the future state of Palestine and the state of Israel in white. Those borders never actually existed in practice. But as a result of the first Arab-Israeli War, which Israelis refer to as the War of Independence, Palestinians refer to as the Nakba or catastrophe, Israel seized more territory than what's depicted here. And then in 1960, so there has never been a state of Palestine established. As a result of that war, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, which you can see in the third map on the left-hand side, and Jordan occupied the West Bank and actually annexed the West Bank to Jordan. So before that, Jordan was referred to as Transjordan, was how it was formerly known, and then afterward it was referred to just as Jordan. In 1967, for reasons that we could get into, Israel went to war with the surrounding Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, as well as the Golan Heights, which aren't really depicted on this map, but are in the northeast corner. So it was in June 1967 in which what's referred to as the military occupation began, which is like a formal legal term in international law. And Israel relies on international law actually to justify its treatment of Palestinians, even as it violates those laws at the same time. So the term occupation is used by advocates with slightly different meanings, but the formal legal application of it refers specifically to the realities following 1967. And so then going to the map on the right, you have what is the reality on the ground of caused by continuous Jewish colonization, Israeli state-directed colonization of Palestinian lands, so that you have Palestinian territories that are turned into islands, essentially, within the West Bank, disconnected from one another. So some of what you have in green are large cities, like Ramallah, like Hebron, like Nablus, and then other parts of it are Area C of the West Bank, which is the sort of agricultural lands. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I know there's a bone of contention with what happened in '67, but so you're saying it's legal under international law for these green areas to have Israeli occupation?
No, I would say that a military occupation as such is not illegal under international law. It's illegal under international law, under the Geneva Conventions, to transfer your own population into occupied territory. There's this larger principle of international law, which we hear a lot about in the case of the war of Ukraine, which says that and this is reaffirmed in resolution, in the resolution that followed the '67 war, which says that it is inadmissible to acquire territory by force. That's a fundamental principle of international law. You can't wage wars against other states in order to take their territory. And so as a part of that, you can't transfer your own population into that territory. So the fragmentation that you see in that map from 2005 is the result of Israel moving its population into the West Bank and bisecting it with Jewish-only highways, Jewish-only settlements, and military checkpoints that encircle these Palestinian areas and separate them from one another, separate them from the outside world, and generally create a hostile environment for them to live in.
So according to international law, that they shouldn't be doing that,
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Got it, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm.
What Zach just described is, I promise I'll come. One more. What Zach just described is called the facts on the ground. When you hear people talk about the facts on the ground and whether or not there can be a two-state solution, that's what they're talking about. One more here, and I promise I'm coming.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I have a couple of questions for you. What was your experience as an American Jew going in and out of the West Bank? And any updates that you have about that right now?
Mm-hmm.
How was your presence there? I don't think you were in Area C. The South Hebron Hills, is that Area C?
Mm-hmm.
But like not in Dura. For example, Dura is A, I believe, like the largest, which is the largest sort of city.
So different parts of the South.
Generally,
yeah.
I'm just more interested, in your experience, because I've also done civil disobedience in Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just trying to figure out what's going to happen when I go back.
Yeah, really good question. So for me, I didn't have any problems, and no one in my cohort of activists had any problems getting into the West Bank from Israel proper or getting into Israel. None of us had issues at the airport. A lot of activists are worried about this for understandable reasons, but we didn't have any issues. In general, these borders are very, to put it bluntly, are very racist. If you're Palestinian, these borders are very real, and you're anxious if you don't have the right permit to cross them. But if you're an Israeli or an international, the borders are more or less meaningless. Like, you can travel very easily to, say, Bethlehem, which is in occupied territory. You can cross through checkpoints, and you may not even really realize that you're going through a checkpoint. There was a few times when we were exiting the West Bank to come into Israel, particularly after this spate of attacks that I mentioned before, these armed attacks against Jewish Israelis, in which there was a few more questions asked, but I was able to, show my passport, or actually a photo of my passport, and I was allowed in. Yeah, so we didn't have any issues there. I will say, though, that the next cohort of the project that I was in, so my project was through the Center for Jewish Nonviolence. It's called Hinenu, which in Hebrew means we are here. The next iteration of it began just a few weeks ago, and within the first 2 weeks, one of the activists, a guy named Dustin, was arrested as he was accompanying a Palestinian farmer. He was arrested under allegations that he was in a closed military zone. The military often will deem swaths of territory to be closed military zones and everybody needs to get out. Allegedly, he was in one of these, and they arrested him. And then they immediately transferred his case to, I believe it was the Department of the Interior, and were threatening him with deportation. And he had a hearing today in which he was threatened with being deported to the United States. He was a Jewish American without Israeli citizenship. And nothing like that happened to us when we were there. But to myself and to, I think, people with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, it feels like a shift that is a part of this new government that came to power in Israel this year, this new Netanyahu government in which Netanyahu is like the most moderate member. He's in coalition with these religious Zionist ministers, including figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's like a arch settler leader who, cut his teeth protesting the Oslo Accords and threatening violence against Yitzhak Rabin, who is then apparently negotiating the end of the conflict. There's a lot of debate about whether that was really the intention or not. Be that as it may, he was seen as the enemy by the right in Israel, and this far right MK really cut his teeth in the opposition to him. And now he's in power, and he's the head of the police in Israel now. So we think that him, as well as another MK, Bezalel Smotrich, are changing the policies about how they treat solidarity activists in the West Bank, and they want to scare us. They want us to be intimidated. They want us to not travel and be in solidarity with people whose human rights are being violated. But I'm a firm believer that we cannot be deterred by that, because if we are, then we let them win. But yeah, so the reality on the ground is changing with regard to how solidarity activists are able to access those places.
And
Thank
I
you.
would say that maybe it's been 5 years or so since I was there, and I was harassed at every border. So
Well, you had a profile at that point, it sounds like.
Yeah. But even on the buses with other American Presbyterians, when we would go into Bethlehem, we would have to wait a long time at those checkpoints, and we were told exactly what to hide and everything before we went over, when the young men got on the bus and checked every one of us deeply. So I'm intrigued that more recently it has seemed that people weren't, because my situation I don't think was unusual at that time.
I'll just say, I felt very harassed at Ben Gurion Airport.
Yes.
Leave it at that.
Yes. Yes. So
And trying to go anyplace else.
I just think that's it's evidently an interesting set of transitions that are going on. So,
Yeah.
I want to thank you both. It's been great, and particularly, Zach, you're calling attention to the visceral trauma that underlies, so that this feeling of betrayal is coupled with a feeling of deep vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think one factor right now is the real anti-Semitic violence that's going on in our situation right here. So far as I know, not in Asheville, but we've had to get a lot of security in Jewish contexts here. And when I talk with my friends who are Jewish, I can sense that there is a different context that they're hearing my ongoing passionate concerns about what's going on in Israel, the government. But it makes it still more complicated. And I think the new government, of course, adds another layer of complication. So it's very
messy.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I think, like any community, right, the Jewish community has a variety of opinion, and there's generational differences. There's a communal establishment which has certain solutions to the very real threat of anti-Semitism in this country, and different solutions that I would say more progressive part of the community holds. For me personally, I believe in safety and solidarity, understanding that the threat of anti-Semitism is inextricably interlinked to anti-black racism, xenophobia, all of these things. And our best path towards safety, again, speaking as myself here, the best path towards safety is building those relationships, building shared understanding and compassion, not closing ourselves off and putting up boundaries in that way. And I think the same goes for the situation in Palestine. There, you have a real kind of fortress mentality that says, we need to take care of our own first and foremost, and then we can worry about other people. I personally disagree with that. I think that the best path forward for Jewish safety in all contexts is to ally ourselves with the people in whatever community that share our belief in human rights, in freedom, equality, all of these things. But I really appreciate you bringing in like that very real context in which these conversations with American Jews is happening, because, yeah, people are feeling threatened, and rightly so. And it's clear to me, and I think it's clear to a lot of people, that the rise of the authoritarian right wing in America is a part of a global movement in which this new Israeli government is certainly a part of, which believes in might makes right, militarized borders, homophobia, like you name the bigotry. It's a part of this global movement, and so again, speaking for myself, we need a kind of international movement to push back on that. And the New Israel Fund is really well placed to be a part of that, because we're based in both Israel and the United States. We're constantly watching the situation in both countries, talking to Jewish people and others who share our values of human rights in both countries, trying to build a broader coalition to push back for democracy in both places.
Because of the intersectionality, I think it's real important when, in a Christian context, the discourse gets into, ableism, sexism, homophobia, that we don't forget to put in anti-Semitism, because it's one and the same.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just really so thrilled to hear this conversation. I've been working in this sector for a long time as a pastor, and I'm really grateful. I'm not sure folks realize how much courage it takes just to sit here and say what you're saying. And I want to just affirm you, particularly as a member of the Jewish community. You are remarkable to be able to speak out with that voice. Bless you for that. But I want to pick up on one thing that you said about generational trauma, because in my experience, I accompanied children, Palestinian children, going to school in Hebron a number of years ago. And we were walking in a little line. We were walking up the hill to their school, which is probably, I don't know if it's even there anymore.
In Twanny? In Hebron?
It was in Atwani, so, but at any rate, I was walking behind a teacher, and there were a family in the settlement down below with their children. And as we were walking, the teacher in front of me was hit in the back of her head by a rock that was thrown by one of the children down below. And for me, the concern is what the generations of children are learning about the enemy, the person that we need to hate. And I wonder if you had any experiences of that kind in working with the shepherds and so on. My my heart was just broken to see a child wanting to hurt someone, and this was a youngster, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7, something like that. But the level of animosity is so great, and there's just no willingness to recognize the other person as a fellow human being, as far as I could tell. It was just heartbreaking, just heartbreaking. And so I wondered if you had any experiences with younger folks.
Well, the first thing I want to say is, first of all, thank you. It does come with some risk to speak out about the human rights abuses that Israel, the successive Israeli governments have committed. But I'll also say that I'm not alone within the Jewish community on this, right? I don't think you were insinuating that, but I want to say that there are a lot of other Jews who feel the same way I do about the situation over there, or feel similarly concerned. There's all these organizations in the U.S., like Jewish Voice for Peace, like If Not Now, J Street, IPFAT, these different groups of Jewish people of various generations who take issue with the policies of all these Israeli governments and want to hold the Israeli government accountable, and also hold our own governments accountable. Okay, so taking my NIF hat on, because we don't really do that part of the thing, but as somebody who is organizing with this group, If Not Now, also trying to hold the U.S. government accountable for its role in all of this, and also to say that there are a lot of Jewish Israelis who see things like I do. Like in my role at the New Israel Fund, mostly what I'm doing is trying to communicate to U.S. audiences, especially U.S. Jewish audiences, what Palestinian but also Israeli civil society leaders are asking from us, and the fights that they're leading. And it's true that Israel has become increasingly right-wing over the years, but there are still outstanding Jewish Israeli leaders who believe in human rights, who want to see an end to the occupation. And I draw a lot of strength and learning from those fellow Jews as well as Palestinians. Yeah, I spent many mornings accompanying the kids on that same walk to school from the village of Tuba to the school in Natwani, past the settlements of Ma'on and Havat Ma'on. I didn't witness any violence against children in that way, but I knew very well the stories and the documented incidents of settlers from those very settlements attacking the kids, and it was as a result of an attack on these Palestinian school children by settlers from Havat Ma'on that the Israeli Knesset said that the army has a responsibility and a duty to accompany these kids on their walk to school in order to ensure their safety. And part of what I was doing, and maybe it sounds like you as well, was making sure that the army would show up and to protect the kids from these settlers. So I didn't witness that, but that was certainly in my consciousness. And when I did see settlers around, like there was one time I remember a young settler boy with a flock that was like a couple dozen meters from us. I had the thought in my mind that this is the history and this very well could happen. But I didn't witness anything like that directly. I mostly witnessed actually the military brutalizing Palestinian adults principally, but also kids during my time there. Actually, on my birthday, there was a raid in the middle of the night on the village of Tuani, in which soldiers descended on the village in the middle of the night, woke everybody up, were marching through the streets, pointing guns at people, telling them get back in your house, and they were roughing up some of the Palestinian youth who came onto the street. And they also assaulted myself and the other Jewish activists who I was with as we tried to document them. That was the most direct kind of violence that I witnessed, other than the kind of ubiquitous structural violence that's going on there.
We have time for one more question. Is there anybody else? Anne? Oh, well, you sure? Who would like this? You can ask it. Answer that. You can have a second.
I want to address the first part of the question to Heath, but I would invite you also, Zach, to comment on my question, if I may. Heath, I remember at the time you were moderator thinking, as I'll bet a lot of us did, we did not envy the position in which you were placed of having to defend in so many forums, you know, the decision that the General Assembly had made. But you said today that you've come to consider some of those leaders of major Jewish congregations good friends. I wonder if you're still in touch with them. I'd be curious because I'm wondering, and this is my question, as the Israeli government has turned so extremely in the rightward direction lately, wonder if that's going to have any impact on their ability to appreciate the distinction we've always wanted them to understand from us, the sharp distinction we make between our feelings for the Jewish people and our concerns about the actions of the Israeli government. I wonder if current developments, in your opinions, might lead to any modification in those attitudes.
I would say yes, as a simple answer. I had the privilege at the end of my term as moderator of being elected to the board of a Presbyterian seminary, Auburn Theological Seminary, in New York City. Auburn does not offer classes or degrees. I mean, it does offer classes and workshops, but not degrees. It is an institution that focuses on human rights, justice issues, and it is comprised of people of all faiths, but has had historically a large representation of Jewish leaders, some of the top Jewish leaders in the country. One of these rabbis was on that board, but I did stay a little bit in touch with the others, but one of them at Central Synagogue, which is one of the granddaddy synagogues, this woman is the rabbi and is a very dear friend. And I would say that among our conversations at board meetings, I've just stepped down, but at our conversations at board meetings, the Jewish leaders and the other people were much more in sync almost always than we were separated. And in a large measure, it's because that concern of overriding the generational issues that many of them had inherited and still must affirm in some ways had become not as significant as unity and finding ways to work together. So my experience has been that the Jewish community, and as I traveled during that time, I met with, one time we brought in 25 Jewish rabbis from the largest synagogues in the nation to meet with me and 25 Presbyterian ministers from their cities and to discuss what was going on. And we entered the room with everybody a little bit suspicious and anxious. We spent the morning at a Presbyterian church and the afternoon at a Jewish synagogue. And by the evening, we were a united body. Now, does that mean that we all agreed, like Democrats and Republicans, or anything like that? No, but it did mean that we were able to really see and understand so much better both sides, and so I feel good that has been transforming some in my experience. Now, Zach, you may have a different feel.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think we've seen since this new far-right government in Israel has come into power that there have been historic, massive demonstrations in Israel. I think yesterday, 2.5% of the whole population, hundreds of thousands of people coming on the streets to protest this new government. Now, the mainstream of this protest is against the judicial reforms that the government wants to push through. Namely, they want to gut the judiciary and basically end judicial oversight in Israel. Now, within those protests, there is a significant but still minority bloc, which is the anti-occupation bloc and the more radical bloc. But that's a present element. So what you have in the U.S. is a lot of Jewish community observing what's going on the ground, seeing this new government, which I believe the vast majority of American Jews do not agree with, particularly as this government is actually, in many senses, at war with the vast majority of American Jewry, making it more difficult for certain Jews to get recognition as Jews within the state of Israel, being one concern. But within this anti-occupation bloc in the Israeli protests, you have people who are trying to make the link between this particular authoritarian government and the policies and practices that Israel's been instituting in the West Bank for decades, to say that when you occupy another people and you institute what is effectively, a military dictatorship over them, which they have no franchise, they have no vote, they have no representation, that blows back, and that corrupts your own society. And so in this way, the occupation dehumanizes, yes, the Palestinians, who are the primary, victims and survivors of it, but also the occupiers. And so I think that's a point that more American Jews are appreciating. I've heard the Union of Reform Judaism, which is the largest denomination of Jews in America, has made increasingly, I would say, brave statements in response to certain Israeli actions, like the forced population transfer or ethnic cleansing in Musafir Yatta that's going on, a part of the South Hebron Hills. The URJ has come out in opposition to that. That feels new. The URJ has also been very vocal in opposition to this new government. So nothing's inevitable, right? Like, we have to, within the Jewish community and outside, we have to keep pushing in order to see those linkages made. But I would say that this is definitely an opportunity to broaden people's scope about just how deep the problems are.
I think that's it now for today. I hope that you will all look at your business cards. It tells you how to reach out to us at Just Peace for Israel Palestine. I want to thank both of you. You're both courageous people, and it's wonderful to see an audience so interested. Nobody fell asleep. Everybody. And Zach, I know you're going back to New York, but if you ever come back to Asheville, we'd welcome you again. Thank you so much. Thank you all, and thank you.
And let me just add, there was a sign-in sheet going around. If you put your email and information on that, you can also get more invitations from the New Israel Fund for educational events online, in which you can hear directly from Israeli and Palestinian civil society leaders who are day in, day out working on these issues. So if you hadn't had a chance to sign in, that's one way you can stay connected.
And JPIP has a list too. Eileen has comment sheets. If anybody would like to leave us a comment, that would be terrific. JPIP's website also has lists of books, movies, other resources that you can avail yourself of. We would love to have a book discussion group, and you're like the perfect people. And perhaps a movie screening closer, maybe at the end of Lent sometime. Thank you, all of you, and thank Grace Covenant.